If you haven't watched the octopus video, which I can't play here, go and watch it because it's really cool. But what we're talking about when we say, how do we know if it's alive and that life adapts, isn't this instantaneous adaptation the octopus can do. It's the fact that it can do it at all. And how do we get to a point where we can have an octopus that can look like a piece of coral? Well, how do we know if it's alive? All right, so here's an example, and this is a real example. There are these moths in England called pepper moths, and in the in the early 1800s, the pepper moths came in two flavors. They came in dark and light, and they lived on these trees that were mostly light. They mostly had this light lichen on them, but occasionally had some dark spots. So the moths were mostly light, but there were a few dark ones that would go hide on the dark spots. Well, the problem for these moths was that they got eaten by birds. They still get eaten by birds. And so the dark ones didn't do very well. And most of the moths were pretty light. And they were mostly kind of speckled, and that's probably why you always got some light ones and some dark ones, because sometimes the speckled ones had light babies, sometimes they had darker speckled babies, but most of them were light and speckled, and the ones that were dark mostly got eaten. All right, well, the Industrial Revolution happened in the 1850s, and then all of a sudden we pumped smog everywhere. And then all of a sudden the trees, totally dark. By the way, history matters, folks, right? So totally dark. And now all of a sudden the dark moths doing much, much better than those poor light moths. And what we find out is that the dark moths weren't getting eaten, the light moths were getting eaten, and the population changed. Life adapted to this new set of circumstances. Natural selection happened, the agent of natural selection, in this case being the birds, and all of a sudden we had a lot more dark moths than light moths. So life changed over time. Life adapted to the new circumstance. It wasn't one individual moth that changed, but overall the population of moths changed. So can we do this in a little bit more formal definition of natural selection? Yes, and we will continue doing this over and over through the semester. But natural selection basically relies on this idea that there is variation in traits among a population. So whether that's size of a plant, whether that's color of an organism, whether that's a behavioral trait, there's variation of the trait. We know that these traits, or in order for them to be selected, these traits are passed on such that the phenotype, such that the trait of the babies is more like the trait of the parents, right? You're more likely to look like your parents than the average kid anywhere else in the world. Now, that doesn't mean you look exactly like your parents, but on average, you look more like them than some random stranger looks like your parents. So there's variation in the traits. If your parents are tall, you're more likely to be tall. If your parents are short, you're more likely to be short. That sort of thing. And then there's selection. Not everybody has the same likelihood to survive. Some things are more likely not to be able to find enough food. Some things are more likely to be eaten by a predator. Some things are more likely to be too bold and go jump off a cliff, right? Are you bold? Are you cautious? So these sorts of things matter. And if you do it wrong, you may not survive. And then over time, over many, many generations, you get changes to the population overall. All right, that's the idea behind natural selection. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. This quote is from The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin in 1859 was the original book. The actual last word of the book was not evolution or evolved in the original edition. It was in subsequent editions. The book also adapted, changed, and evolved. But we'll talk a bunch about this Darwin's theory where Darwin was wrong. Turns out his genetics knowledge was just wrong. His model of inheritance was wrong. So we'll keep talking about him through the semester. But one of the things we know about life is it adapts according to natural selection.